Dad Barker's Ghost by R.C. Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Braymiller. Dad Barker's Ghost by R.C. Canterbury. While I ain't got no serious objection to anybody's particular brand of religion, began Sonora Bill, the same being peculiarly their own affair, like their particular brand of liquor or tobacco, I sure maintains it is my firm conviction and belief that the fakes and false prophets hooked up with several of the current and popular brands who are going up and down the country seeking what they may devour along about dinner time are some numerous, and ought to be suppressed a whole lot for the good of the order. Which same is not said in a spirit of carping criticism, as I may say, me being ready to extend the right hand of fellowship to any hombre, whether he be Methodist, Protestant, or suffragist. The only thing I inquires about being said hombre's honesty and his peculiar belief, which same I reserves likewise for myself. Which the case I has in mind calling forth these few remarks is that of this two-legged he-person over in Cerdo, who calls himself a spiritualist or clairvoyant or something like that. I confesses here and now that my attendance at churches has been some few and far between, and likewise my sabe of the finer points of the game some vague and nebulous, as I may say. But when it comes to bringing up spirits of the departed, I sure professes to qualify as an expert. This locoed galoot who's at present extracting pesos from the pockets of the proletariat of Cerdo is not the first of the breed it's been my happy fortune to bump up against, and I may say with truth the first application sure took good and plenty. I wouldn't believe in a ghost if he carried his own burial certificate round with him and brought 3 more spooks along as witnesses, and even at that I ain't saying but what there may be honest spooks, but the only ones I ever see sure were liars, and the truth was not in 'em. I never does figure it out in my own mind who starts it, whether it were Bob Hawkins or Sam Kinney or Sile Cooper, or maybe it was old Dad Barker begins it when he croaks. But anyway, she starts, and she sure assumes some large proportions muy pronto, which she happens like this. Me and Bob Hawkins finishes cutting hay on Colonel Borden's place down the valley and drifts over to town to lay up for a spell. I reckon we puts away about 1,000,000 bales of hay that season, and she's sure some job, but I maintains the hardest of it is having to live for 3 or 4 months with Bob Hawkins. I can't just name offhand any single hombre as I'd enjoy hearing the sound of his voice exclusive for that length of time, but if I was to make up a list of the humans that I'd sure hate to be thrown in company with for that long, Bob Hawkins' name would head the list. Somehow I gather that Bob kind of thinks the same about me for some reason. Well, we tells each other everything we knows and a thunderin' lot we don't in the first few days, and then we starts argufying, and derned if I ever see such a argufying cuss as Bob. We argufies about everything we can think of, beginning with the price of hay and the Mexican situation and finally winding up on ghosts. I always maintains and always will that there ain't no such animal, that she always turns out to be a white cow or a rock or a union suit somebody has forgot to take off the line. But Bob, he tries to down me by quoting from Shakespeare and the Bible and Ayer's Almanac and such like authorities in a loud tone of voice. I never see such a cantankerous cuss as that Bob Hawkins in my life. We don't seem to be able to settle that argument no way. Most times when we runs out of argument and gets tired of abusing each other, we just goes round and won't talk for a day or two until something else comes up to argufy about. But this time she's plumb serious. So when we drifts into Cerdo, we argufies all the way, and after we has a drink or so, we sets down at a table in the Palace Bar and keeps her up. You know how it is when you get to argufying where there's a crowd. Every darn fool there has to put his lip in, whether he knows anything about it or not. I hasn't called Bob a liar and proved it more'n twice till there's 8 or 10 other yaps taking sides and offering to bet they're right. I reckon old Sile Cooper is the worst. When that old gin-head sets in a game, he sure perjures himself some scandalous. He swears that he's not only seen ghosts, but has held converse with 'em. And old Jim Tate, I kind of 'spects Jim to stick to me, but to hear that old fool run on about spirit rapping and table tilting was sinful. Of course, I has Sam Kinney and a few more on my side, but shucks, we can't talk near loud enough to win no argument. Argument is a lot like love. Whichever way she turns out, she leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and they're alike in lots of other ways, too. But, at the same time, she's a plumb human trait. You get a lot of fool he-men together and let 'em start one of these here long-winded red-hot arguments with everybody taking sides, and she most always winds up one of two ways. They either gets plumb peeved and hostile at one another, or they starts to bettin', which is what happens to this little debate. Bob Hawkins, figuring to make a grandstand play before the crowd, suddenly fishes out a roll of good paper money and slams her down on the table. "There's 100 perfectly good pesos," he says, "which I've sure perspired some strenuous to collect, and that dinero says there's plenty of evidence of ghosts, which I plays her straight as she lays and pauses for some of you galoots to cover the bet." Now, I've always maintained that backing your opinion with your bankroll is plumb poor argument, but at the same time it's sure human. So I reaches for my own bundle and slams her down. "Bob Hawkins," says I, "me and you has fit bled and argufied for some several weeks in that hay pasture, and I've tried in my poor weak way to show you the error of your ways and point out to you your various shortcomin's. But if nothing but separating you from your filthy coin will convince you that you're locoed and a dad-blamed idjit besides, your Uncle Pete will sure proceed to the separatin'. Son, your bet's covered, and with your kind and indulgent permission, we places the dinero in the keepin' of our esteemed fellow townsman Doc Stringer to hold till same is decided, so trot out your ghost." Bob, he don't make no kick on the Doc holding the money, but just kind of grins nasty-like and says, "Wait and see." The Doc, being the official stakeholder of the community, gets some dignified and sort of pompous like he always does, and writes each of us a receipt on a prescription blank. "In accepting the position of arbiter in this momentous case," he says, "I naturally inquires how the same is to be settled. As I understand her, our esteemed fellow citizen, Mr. Bob Hawkins, is to produce evidence of the existence of disembodied spirits, which, I take it, has to be done in sufficient manner to convince the party of the other part, our likewise esteemed fellow citizen, Mr. Pete Suggs, otherwise known as Sonora Pete. This being the manner in which I diagnoses the case, I inquires from Mr. Bob Hawkins as to how he intends to produce said evidence." "It being my only desire," says Bob, "to prove that truth is mighty and will prevail, and to convince this old wall-eyed coyote that I'm right as usual, I submits that if I produces before the citizenship of Cerdo, and this old reprobate in particular, the human ghost of some deceased party within reasonable time, I wins the bet. Does that satisfy you?" he says to me. "She do," I says. "Only me not believin' in 'em none in the first place, I protests against your ringin' in strange and unknown phantoms, and holds out for the ghost of some late lamented that we're acquainted with, which same I maintains is only fair and intended to exclude impostors." "I even agree to them terms," says Bob. "Name your deceased hombre." Somebody suggests old Tristaboricon, the greaser that tried to steal powder from the Picaro Company's powder house while smoking a cigarette, but seeing that they only found a finger or two and part of his sombrero, Bob protests that it's putting too great a job on Providence to collect the material for a ghost, and besides some of the crowd objects that a greaser, not having a soul nohow, wouldn't be apt to have a ghost. Sile Cooper then mentions Bill Lemon's first, or maybe it was his second wife. Anyway, it was the one which dies, but Bill raises such a row about it that Sile don't insist none. Derned if it warn't funny, considerin' the number of corpses that's happened in and around Cerdo in the past few years, how few of 'em anybody wanted back. Which we finally fixes on old Dad Barker, him that shuffles off this mortal coil when him and Sam Kinney was placer mining up in Corvo Canyon. Nobody has anything much against old Dad, though I don't think he does me just right about that flea-bit sorrel I trades him for the year Bryant runs for president. "I accepts the corpse," says Bob, "and I guarantees to produce the spook within 2 weeks from tonight. As I take it, the only thing necessary is to produce the spirit of Dad Barker, the manner of doing which being our own affair exclusive. I don't mind stating, however, that I'm aiming to import a party from El Paso for the purpose, which raisin' spooks is his regular occupation. Me and Sam Kinney ain't particular strong for an outside party, but we don't suspect nothing's wrong with the deal till the next day, when Sam tells me that Bob borrows an old photograph of him and Dad Barker, which was took by that lunger picture guy about a year ago. Which I don't impugn his motives none whatever, says Sam, me not being prone to ascribe dishonorable intentions to nobody. But what for he wants a chromo of me and Dad, the same not doing me justice and failing to bring out my best points, I sure can't see. She does look some suspicious for a fact. If this party from El Paso is so plumb familiar with spooks that he's on speaking terms with 'em, what's he want with a picture? We finally figures it out that maybe he needs to identify Dad by after he cuts him out of the herd. But I remarks that if he tries to pick Dad out by the picture, he's sure got a job on, because that picture's the only time anybody ever sees Dad dressed up and his jaw's not working on his cud. You know how these photograph sharps make a feller stand or set when they unlimbers the camera on them, with a two-pronged pitchfork clamped on his dome to hold him straight, and him trying to look pleasant so darned hard he's straining his face. Well, in this picture, old Dad is standing up straight and dignified, not humped over as usual, and sure looks imposing and proud. He's got all shaved up nice and clean, top lip and all, which shows it was some barber job and not Dad's usual homemade scrape. He's got one hand on Sam's shoulder, kind of protectin' like, Sam squatting in a chair with his hands spread out on his knees and his old bald head a-shinin' and his rope yarn mustache a-spreadin' all over his face. The whole dern pose looks a heap like Sam was getting ready to bark at somebody and Dad is trying to quiet him. I remarks something like this to Sam, but he don't take it kindly, him being sort of jealous of his looks. Monday morning, our imported ghostmaster drifts in on the overland with his family. He's a tall, rangy, sickly-looking guy, dressed all in black and looking a heap like an undertaker or a doctor. Maybe that's because their jobs are something alike, only different. One hasn't 'em off, as I may say, and the other enticing 'em back. His wife, I reckon she was, is a little fat dumpy female with a poker face and one of these smiles that don't go any higher up her features than her nose. They heads for the Oriental house with about a dozen of us trailing along behind with our fool mouths hanging open like we was watching for spirits of the departed to come flocking around and begin a ghost dance. Notices is flung round the town that afternoon for a seance, as they calls it, at the Woodman Hall that night, admission 25 cents, which looks sort of sordid and commercial, as I may say, but we reckons that ghostmasters has to eat and buy things the same as other folk. Me and Sam Kinney gets in the hall kind of late that night, most of the crowd having already arrived and the festivities just ready to begin. Our respected and successfully dodged maiden school teacher, Miss Arabella Dobbs, is playing kind of soft-like on the piano, extracting agony from my old favorite, The Ship That Never Returned, and the lights are turned down low. Me and Sam sidles round the wall so as not to attract attention and sort of eases ourselves into seats round to one side and near the front. Miss Arabella finally wrecks the ship and stops, and the spook sharp requests 3 or 4 of us to tie him up in what he calls the cabinet, which I always figures heretofore a cabinet with some kind of furniture. This time she turns out to be a little coop they has fenced off in one corner with some curtains. Well, me being interested to the extent of $100, I naturally trails along to see that a good job is did, which she sure was. We sets him down and ties his hands and feet to the chair and ties a handkerchief over his eyes. I sure satisfies myself that hombre don't do any gallivanting round playing ghost. Then we pulls the curtains round him and moseys back to our seats. Miss Arabella and some of the other females present starts a kind of hymn tune, singing and playing sort of slow and solemn like they do at funerals. She sure sounds some mournful and makes me remember all the mean things I ever did. You know what I mean. Like when it's bright moonlight and sort of frosty and you're a long way from home and tired and the coyotes are yapping way off in the mesa and you're broke and just getting over a big drunk and has lost your job. Oh, shucks, it ain't like that either. It's more like when you wake up and hear a funny noise late at night and you just know it's a rattlesnake, but you can't locate him and you're afraid to move. It's just expecting things to happen and ain't right sure what they're going to be when they do. I glances over at Sam and he's setting there grinning, but she sure ain't what you might call a pleased grin. It's too nervous-like, and I kind of feel that I'm doing the same. I reckon it ain't more'n a minute or 2, but it sure seems like an hour. We hear a tambourine glanging away, kind of soft-like, but getting louder all the time, and pretty soon here she comes sailing over the top of the curtains and falls on the floor with a bang. Honest, I could feel the hair riz up on my backbone. Then a bell starts ringing, and pretty soon it follers the tambourine over the curtains. I hear Uncle Jed Weatherby behind me chawing real fast on his tobacco, and I know that I ain't the only one feeling creepy. Uncle Jed usually chaws at a rate of 120 to the minute, unless he gets scared or mad, and then he begins to speed. I'm watching the cabinet pretty close, and right after the bell comes over, I begin to see a dim blue light up near the top of the curtains. Presently she gets brighter, and then I see a hand like it was all fire sort of waving slow over the top. I'm kind of wishing by now that me and Sam hadn't got so darn near the front. She sure would have been a heap more comfortable back near the door. After this flamin' hand sort of burns itself out, a dim light begins shining through the curtains, getting brighter and then going down again, and then it seems to come right through the curtains and begins to form itself into a human figure on our side. Uncle Jed is sure exceeding the speed limit with that cut of his by now. I can feel his chin whiskers tickling the back of my neck every time he chaws, him looking over the top of my head. The figure keeps on getting plainer and plainer till we can see it's some kind of Injun from a tribe I don't know. It ain't no Navajo, nor Apache, nor Pima, nor Maricopa, nor Papago, nor none of the Injuns we're used to, but it's sure Injun for all that, and it starts walking toward us, talking some kind of outlandish stuff which say may be its native tongue for all I know. I feels a cold something like ice water running down the back of my wishbone, and I can't figure whether I'm getting cold sweats or Uncle Jed's tobacco is dribbling, and I ain't taking the trouble right then to find out. I reaches back and gets a good grip on my old 45. Not that she'd have been much use if this is a real ghost, but I figures that I'll sure feel a whole lot better if I can unlimber her if that darn Injun gets too close. But the Injun finally circles round and goes back to the curtains and disappears, and I hears plenty more besides me kind of sigh real heartfelt and deep. The lights are turned up bright after a minute, and 2 or 3 of us goes and has a look at the spook foreman. He's settin' there all tied up tight as ever, looking kind of sick and pasty-like, which I don't wonder at none, seeing as how I'd probably be looking the same way if I was in his place. Of course, I still ain't convinced that I'm going to lose my bet, but I sure would have admired to call this thing off right here and now. But she ain't over yet, and after another hymn tune or two, they turns the lamps down again, and we're off once more. Well, she starts pretty much the same as before, with bells ringing and somebody playing on a mandolin and such like, and this creepy feeling coming back stronger than ever. And presently that blue light begins shining again, and another spook begins developing right before our eyes. Uncle Jed starts speeding up on his cut as before, and pretty soon we see the new phantom walking toward us. Before it gets plain enough to see very good, we hears the voice of the boss of the works saying from the cabinet, "The spirit of Nathaniel Barker desires to communicate with someone present." Right here is where I gets a good grip on my chair and prepares to lose 100 pesos. I hear a little shuffle down the room like people uncrossing their legs and kind of straightening up, and Uncle Jed's speed goes up another notch. Everybody has got their eyes fixed on that spook and wishing his chair had rollers under it so he could push it back without drawing attention to himself. In a moment the light or the ghost or something gets strong enough to see plain, and derned if I know whether I'm disappointed or not. One thing is sure, she ain't Dad Barker. The figure I sees is short and kind of bow-legged and is bald on top and is inclined to be fat all in one place. You know how I mean, kettle-bellied. There's a kind of gasp and a gulp behind me, and I figures Uncle Jed has finally swallowed his cud, and I sets there with my eyes popping way out and hears a sort of gasp go down the room, and then Sam Kinney jumps right up and yells out, "Hell, it's me! The darn digit's gone and materialized me!" And I'll be derned if he ain't right. It sure was old Sam Kinney to the life. Even the clothes look like Sam's Sunday suit, which he's had for about 10 years. It's like Sam was looking in the glass at himself. While I was getting my senses back and trying to digest all this, Sam clambers over my legs and out on the floor where his ghost was, hauling his 6-gun out as he comes. "I'm a ghost, am I?" he yells. "You derned old fraud! I'm a spook and a phantom and don't know when I'm dead, huh? Whoopee!" And bang goes his old gun. Sam's ghost hops about 2 feet straight up in the air and yells, "Wow!" "Give me room," yells Sam. "Right here's where I lays my own ghost." And bang goes the old 45 again. The ghost starts to run, but Sam gets in between it and the cabinet and heads it off. All this time a commotion is going on in the cabinet, and at Sam's second shot, down comes the curtains and out rolls the ghost herder, still tied up and tangled in the curtains and chair. Somebody turns a couple of the lamps up, and everybody is up on their hind legs, some trying to get closer to see what's going on, and some more trying to get out. But Sam keeps dancing round his ghost, shooting holes in the floor every so often, and yelling like a drunken patchy. "Vanish, durn ye," he hollers. "Go off in blue flame and sulphur. Whoop!" The ghost is hopping round and yelling every time Sam shoots, and I notices that while it sure looks like Sam, its voice ain't a bit like his'n. Sam's voice being a crackled bass and the spook's a high treble. The ghost tries to dodge, and it and Sam go hopping back and forth, facing each other like one of these newfangled dances. Finally, the spirit ducks, and Sam makes a grab and gets it by the arm. Then the ghost gets a grip on Sam's ear, and they starts another fancy two-step round and round. In the mix-up, the ghost's bald head comes off. Huh? That's right. I mean, the bald part comes off, only there's plenty of hair underneath, and also the mustache comes away in sections, and then we begins to see a great light, at least those of us who saw them arrive at the depot, because this ghost of Sam is the hard-featured female which I surmises is the professor's wife. But the way that fat she-wildcat is clawing Sam's face and neck and trying to bite him in vulnerable spots is plumb scandalous. Sam has dropped his gun when they begins to dance, and when he sees what it is has got him, he begins to holler for somebody to take it off, which it takes about 6 of us to do, and we all gets more or less scratched up in the operation. We finally quiets her and Sam down, and then we resurrects the professor from where he's hard at work kicking the chair and curtains to pieces. He wants to fight when we first unties him, but we simmers him down, and finally they fesses up. They blames Bob a whole lot for giving 'em a wrong steer and not explaining more fully which hombre in the picture they was to materialize. We feel some sore at 'em, of course, on account of the fake, but as I wins my bet, I'm willing to be easy, so we kindly but firmly suggest that they leave town sudden-like and lets it go at that. Bob Hawkins actually has the nerve to kick on the doc turning the money over to me, claiming that the ghost of the Injun's genuine anyway, but that don't get him nowhere with the doc, who forks over pronto. In fact, the crowd rides Bob so hard that he threatens to shoot the next guy who mentions the name of Dad Barker, and Sam Kinney gets hot every time he hears an Injun ghost dance, taking it as a personal reflection. Which brings me back to what I says before. There may be ghosts, and then again, maybe there ain't, but whichever way she is, I sure don't believe in 'em. End of Dad Barker's Ghost.
A Child of the Rain by Elijah Wilkinson Petey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Child of the Rain by Elijah Wilkinson Petey. It was the night that Mona Meeks, the dressmaker, told him she didn't love him. He couldn't believe it at first, because he had so long been accustomed to the idea that she did, and no matter how rough the weather or how irascible the passengers, he felt a song in his heart as he punched transfers and rang his bell punch and signalled the driver when to let people off and on. Now, suddenly, with no reason except a woman's, she had changed her mind. He dropped in to see her at 5 o'clock, just before time for the night shift, and to give her 2 red apples he had been saving for her. She looked at the apples as if they were invisible and she could not see them, and standing in her disorderly little dressmaking parlour, with its cuttings and scraps and litter of fabrics, she said, "It is no use, John. I shall have to work here like this all my life. Work here alone. For I don't love you, John. No, I don't. I thought I did, but it is a mistake." "You mean it?" asked John, bringing up the words in a great gasp. "Yes," she said, white and trembling, and putting out her hands as if to beg for his mercy. And then, big lumbering fool, He turned around and strode down the stairs and stood at the corner in the beating rain waiting for his car. It came along at length, spluttering on the wet rails and spitting out blue fire, and he took his shift, after a gruff "Good night" to Johnson, the man he relieved. He was glad the rain was bitter cold and drove in his face fiercely. He rejoiced at the cruelty of the wind, and when it hustled pedestrians before it, lashing them, twisting their clothes, and threatening their equilibrium, he felt amused. He was pleased at the chill in his bones and at the hunger that tortured him. At least, at first he thought it was hunger till he remembered that he had just eaten. The hours passed confusedly. He had no consciousness of time, but it must have been late, near midnight, judging by the fact that there were few persons visible anywhere in the black storm, when he noticed a little figure sitting at the far end of the car. He had not seen the child when she got on, but all was so curious and wild to him that evening. He himself seemed to himself the most curious and the wildest of all things, that it was not surprising that he should not have observed the little creature. She was wrapped in a coat so much too large that it had become frayed at the bottom from dragging on the pavement. Her hair hung in unkempt stringiness about her bent shoulders, and her feet were covered with old arctics, many sizes too big, from which the soles hung loose. Beside the little figure was a chest of dark wood, with curiously wrought hasps. From this depended a stout strap by which it could be carried over the shoulders. John Billings stared in, fascinated by the poor little thing with its head sadly drooping upon its breast, its thin blue hands relaxed upon its lap, and its whole attitude so suggestive of hunger, loneliness, and fatigue, that he made up his mind he would collect no fare from it. "It will need its nickel for breakfast," he said to himself. "The company can stand this for once. Or, come to think of it, I might celebrate my hard luck. Here's to the brotherhood of failures!" And he took a nickel from one pocket of his greatcoat and dropped it in another, ringing his bell punch to record the transfer. The car plunged along in the darkness, and the rain beat more viciously than ever in his face. The night was full of the rushing sound of the storm. Owing to some change of temperature, the glass of the car became obscured, so that the young conductor could no longer see the little figure distinctly, and he grew anxious about the child. "I wonder if it's all right," he said to himself. "I never saw living creature sit so still." He opened the car door, intending to speak with the child, but just then something went wrong with the lights. There was a blue and green flickering, then darkness, a sudden halting of the car, and a great sweep of wind and rain in at the door. When, after a moment, light and motion reasserted themselves, and Billings had got the door together, he turned to look at the little passenger. But the car was empty. It was a fact. There was no child there, not even moisture on the seat where she had been sitting. "Bill," said he, going to the front door and addressing the driver, "what became of that little kid in the old cloak?" "I didn't see no kid," said Bill, crossly. "For Gawd's sake close the door, John, and get that draught off my back." "Draught?" said John, indignantly. "Where's the draught?" "You've left the hind door open," growled Bill, and John saw him shivering as a blast struck him and ruffled the fur on his bearskin coat. But the door was not open, and yet John had to admit to himself that the car seemed filled with wind and a strange coldness. However, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Still, it was as well, no doubt, to look under the seats just to make sure no little crouching figure was there, and so he did. But there was nothing. In fact, John said to himself, he seemed to be getting expert in finding nothing where there ought to be something. He might have stayed in the car, for there was no likelihood of more passengers that evening, but somehow he preferred going out where the rain could drench him and the wind pommel him. How horribly tired he was! If there were only some still place away from the blare of the city, where a man could lie down and listen to the sound of the sea or the storm, or if one could grow suddenly old and get through with the bother of living, or if— The car gave a sudden lurch as it rounded a curve, and for a moment it seemed to be a mere chance whether Conductor Billings would stay on his platform or go off under those fire-spitting wheels. He caught instinctively at his brake, saved himself, and stood still for a moment, panting. "I must have dozed," he said to himself. Just then, dimly, through the blurred window, he saw again the little figure of the child, its head on its breast as before, its blue hands lying in its lap, and the curious box beside it. John Billings felt a coldness beyond the coldness of the night run through his blood. Then, with a half-stifled cry, he threw back the door, and made a desperate spring at the corner where the eerie thing sat. And he touched the green carpeting on the seat, which was quite dry and warm, as if no dripping, miserable little wretch had ever crouched there. He rushed to the front door. "Bill!" he roared, "I want to know about that kid." "What kid?" "The same kid, the wet one with the old coat and the box with iron hasps. The one that's been sitting here in the car." Bill turned his surly face to confront the young conductor. "You've been drinking, you fool," said he. "First thing you know you'll be reported." The conductor said not a word. He went slowly and weakly back to his post, and stood there the rest of the way leaning against the end of the car for support. Once or twice he muttered, "The poor little brat," and again he said, "So you didn't love me after all." He never knew how he reached home, but he sank to sleep as dying men sink to death. All the same, being a hearty young man, he was on duty again next day but one, and again the night was rainy and cold. It was the last run, and the car was spinning along at its limit when there came a sudden soft shock. John Billings knew what that meant. He had felt something of the kind once before. He turned sick for a moment and held on to the brake. Then he summoned his courage and went around to the side of the car, which had stopped. Bill, the driver, was before him, and had a limp little figure in his arms, and was carrying it to the gaslight. John gave one look and cried, "It's the same kid, Bill, the one I told you of." True as truth were the ragged coat dangling from the pitiful body, the little blue hands, the thin shoulders, the stringy hair, the big arctics on the feet. And in the road not far off was the curious chest of dark wood with iron hasps. "She ran under the car deliberate," cried Bill. "I yelled to her, but she looked at me and ran straight on." He was white, in spite of his weather-beaten skin. "I guess you wasn't drunk last night after all, John," said he. You are sure the kid is there?" gasped John. "Not so damned sure," said Bill. But a few minutes later it was taken away in a patrol wagon, and with it the little box with iron hasps. End of A Child of the Rain.
Ring Once for Death by Robert Arthur. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Pyle. Ring Once for Death by Robert Arthur. 20 years had left no trace inside Sam Key's little shop on Mott Street. There were the same dusty jars of ginseng root and tiger's whiskers, The same little bronze Buddhas. The same gimcracks mixed with fine jade. Edith Williams gave a little murmur of pleasure as the door shut behind them. "Mark," she said, "it hasn't changed. It doesn't look as if a thing has been sold since we were here on our honeymoon." "It certainly doesn't," Dr. Mark Williams agreed, moving down the narrow aisle behind her. "If someone hadn't told us Sam Kee was dead, I'd believe we'd stepped back 20 years in time, like they do in those scientific stories young David reads." "We must buy something," his wife said, "for a 20th anniversary present for me. Perhaps a bell." From the shadowy depths of the shop a young man emerged, American in dress and manner despite the Oriental contours of his face and eyes. "Good evening," he said. "May I show you something?" "We think we want a bell," Dr. Williams chuckled, "but we aren't quite sure. You're Sam Kee's son?" "Sam Kee, Jr. My honored father passed to the halls of his ancestors 5 years ago. I could just say that he died." Black eyes twinkled. "But customers like the more flowery mode of speech. They think it's quaint." "I think it's just nice and not quaint at all," Edith Williams declared. "We're sorry your father is dead. We'd hoped to see him again. 20 years ago, when we were a very broke young couple on a honeymoon, he sold us a wonderful rose crystal necklace for half price. I'm sure he still made a profit." The black eyes twinkled again. "But if you'd like a bell, here are some small temple bells, camel bells, dinner bells." But even as he spoke, Edith Williams' hand darted to something at the back of the shelf. "A bell carved out of crystal!" she exclaimed. "And rose crystal at that! What could be more perfect? A rose crystal wedding present and a rose crystal anniversary present." The young man half stretched out his hand. "I don't think you want that," he said. "It's broken." "Broken?" Edith Williams rubbed off the dust and held the lovely bell shape of crystal, the size of a pear, to the light. "It looks perfect to me." "I mean it's not complete." Something of the American had vanished from the young man. "It has no clapper. It will not ring." "Why, that's right." Mark Williams took the bell. "The clapper's missing." "We can have another clapper made," his wife declared. "That is, if the original can't be found." The young Chinese shook his head. "The bell and the clapper were deliberately separated by my father 20 years ago." He hesitated, then added, "My father was afraid of this bell." "Afraid of it?" Mark Williams raised his eyebrows. The other hesitated again. "It will probably sound like a story for tourists," he said, "but my father believed it. This bell was supposedly stolen from the temple of a sect of Buddhists somewhere in the mountains of China's interior. Just as many Occidentals believe that the Christian Judgment Day will be heralded by a blast on St. Peter's trumpet, so this small sect is said to believe that when a bell like this one is rung, a bell carved from a single piece of rose crystal and consecrated by ceremonies lasting 10 years, any dead within sound of it will rise and live again." "Heavenly!" Edith Williams cried. "And no pun intended. Mark, think what a help this bell will be in your practice when we make it ring again." To the Chinese she added, smiling, "I'm just teasing him. My husband is really a very fine surgeon." The other bowed his head. "I must tell you, you will not be able to make it ring. Only the original clapper, carved from the same block of rose crystal, will ring it. That is why my father separated them." Again he hesitated. "I have told you only half of what my father told me. He said that, though it defeats death, death cannot be defeated. Robbed of his chosen victim, he takes another in his place. Thus, when the bell was used in the temple of its origin, let us say when a high priest or a chief had died, a slave or servant was placed handy for death to take, when he had been forced to relinquish his grasp upon the important one." He smiled and shook his head. "There," he said, "a preposterous story. Now, if you wish it, the bell is $10, plus, of course, sales tax." "The story alone is worth more," Dr. Williams declared. "I think we'd better have it sent, hadn't we, Edith? It will be safer in the mail than in our suitcase." "Sent?" His wife seemed to come out of some deep feminine meditation. "Oh, of course. And as for its not ringing, I shall make it ring. I know I shall." "If the story is true," Mark Williams murmured. "I hope not." The package came on a Sunday morning when Mark Williams was catching up on the latest medical publications in his untidy, book-lined study. He heard Edith unwrapping paper in the hall outside, then she came in with the rose crystal bell in her hands. "Mark, it's here," she said. "Now to make it ring." She plumped herself down beside his desk. He took the bell and reached for his silver pencil. "Just for the sake of curiosity," he remarked, "and not because I believe that delightful sales talk we were given. Let's see if it will ring when I tap. It should, you know." He tapped the lip of the bell. A muted thunk was the only response. Then he tried with a coin, a paper knife, and the bottom of a glass. In each instance, the resulting sound was nothing like a bell ringing. "If you've finished, Mark," Edith said then, with feminine tolerance, "let me show you how it's done." "Gladly," her husband agreed. She took the bell and turned away for a moment. Then she shook the bell vigorously. A clear, sweet ringing shivered through the room, so thin and ethereal that small, involuntary shivers crawled up his spine. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed. "How did you do that?" "I just put the clapper back in place with some thread," Edith told him. "The clapper?" He shook his forehead with his palm. "Don't tell me. The crystal necklace we bought 20 years ago." "Of course." Her tone was composed. "As soon as young Sam Key told us about his father separating the clapper and the bell, I remembered the central crystal pendant on my necklace. It is shaped like a bell clapper. We mentioned it once. I guessed right away we had the missing clapper. But I didn't say so. I wanted to score on you, Mark." She smiled affectionately at him. "And because, you know, I had a queer feeling Sam Key Jr. wouldn't let us have the bell if he guessed we had the clapper." "I don't think he would." Mark Williams picked up his pipe and rubbed the bowl with his thumb. "Yet he didn't really believe that story he told us any more than we do." "No, but his father did. And if old Sam Key had told it to us, remember how wrinkled and wise he seemed, I do believe we'd have believed the story." "You're probably right." Dr. Williams rang the bell and waited. The thin, sweet sound seemed to hang in the air a long moment, then was gone. "Nope," he said. "Nothing happened. Although, of course, that may be because there was no deceased around to respond. I'm not sure I feel like joking about the story." A small frown gathered on Edith's forehead. "I had planned to use the bell as a dinner bell and to tell the story to our guests. But now I'm not sure." Frowning, she stared at the bell until the ringing of the telephone in the hall brought her out of her abstraction. "Sit still, I'll answer," she hurried out. Dr. Williams, turning the rose crystal bell over in his hand, could hear the sudden tension in her voice as she answered. He was on his feet when she re-entered. "An emergency operation at the hospital," she sighed. "Nice young man, automobile accident. Fracture of the skull, Dr. Amos says. He wouldn't have disturbed you, but you're the only brain man in town with Dr. Hendricks away on vacation." "I know." He was already in the hall, reaching for his hat. "Man's work is from sun to sun, but a doctor's work is never done," he misquoted. "I'll drive you." Edith followed him out. "You sit back and relax for another 10 minutes." 2 hours later, as they drove homeward, the traffic was light, which was fortunate. More than once Mark, in a frowning abstraction, found himself on the left of the center lane and had to pull back into his own lane. He had lost patience before, but never without a feeling of personal defeat. Edith said he put too much of himself into every operation. Perhaps he did. And yet, no, there was every reason why the young men should have lived. Yet, just as Mark Williams had felt that he had been successful, the patient had died. In 20 years of marriage, Edith Williams had learned to read his thoughts at times. Now she put a hand comfortingly on his arm. "These things happen, darling," she said. "You know that. A doctor can only do so much. Some of the job always remains in the hands of nature. And she does play tricks at times." "Yes, confound it, I know it," her husband growled. "But I resent losing that lad. There was no valid reason for it, unless there was some complication I overlooked." He shook his head, scowling. "I ordered an autopsy, but yes, I'm going to do that autopsy myself. I'm going to turn back and do it now. I have to know." He pulled abruptly to the left to swing into a side road and turn. Edith Williams never saw the car that hit them. She heard the frantic blare of a horn and a scream of brakes, and in a frozen instant realized there had been someone behind them about to pass. Then the impact came, throwing her forward into the windshield and unconsciousness. Edith Williams opened her eyes, even before she realized that she was lying on the ground, and that the figure bending over her was a state trooper. She remembered the crash. Her head hurt, but there was no confusion in her mind. Automatically, even as she tried to sit up, she accepted the fact that there had been a crash. Help had come, and she must have been unconscious for several minutes at least. "Hey, lady, take it easy," the trooper protested. "You had a bad bump. You got to lie still until the ambulance gets here. It'll be along in 5 minutes." "Mark," Edith said, paying no attention. "My husband, is he all right?" "Now, lady, please. He's being taken care of. You—" But she was not listening. Holding to his arm, she pulled herself to a sitting position. She saw their car on its side some yards away. Other cars pulled up around them. A little knot of staring people. Saw them and dismissed them. Her gaze found her husband, lying on the ground a few feet away, a coat folded beneath his head. Mark was dead. She had been a doctor's wife for 20 years, and before that a nurse. She knew death when she saw it. "Mark." The word was spoken to herself, but the trooper took it for a question. "Yes, lady," he said. "He's dead. He was still breathing when I got here, but he died 2-3 minutes ago." She got to her knees. Her only thought was to reach his side. She scrambled across the few feet of ground to him, still on her knees, and crouched beside him, fumbling for his pulse. There was none. There was nothing. Just a man who had been alive and now was dead. Behind her, she heard a voice raised. She turned. A large, disheveled man was standing beside the trooper, talking loudly. "Now listen, officer," he was saying. "I'm telling you again, it wasn't my fault. The guy pulled sharp left right in front of me. Not a thing I could do. It's a wonder we weren't all 3 of us killed. You can see by the marks on their car it wasn't my fault." Edith Williams closed her mind to the voice. She let Mark's hand lie in her lap as she fumbled in her bag, which was somehow still clutched in her fingers. She groped for a handkerchief to stem the tears which would not be held back. Something was in the way. Something smooth and hard and cold. She drew it out and heard the thin, sweet tinkle of the crystal bell. She must have dropped it automatically into her bag as they were preparing to leave the house. The hand in her lap moved. She gasped and bent forward as her husband's eyes opened. "Mark," she whispered. "Mark, darling." "Edith," Mark Williams said with an effort. "Sorry, damned careless of me, thinking of the hospital." "You're alive," she said. "You're alive. Oh, darling, darling, lie still. The ambulance will be here any second." "Ambulance?" he protested. "I'm all right now. Help me. Sit up." "But Mark—" "Just a bump on the head." He struggled to sit up. The state trooper came over. "Easy, buddy, easy," he said, his voice awed. "We thought you were gone. Now let's not lose you a second time." His mouth was tight. "Hey, I'm glad you're all right," the red-faced man said in a rush of words. "Whew, fella, you had me all upset, even though it wasn't my fault. I mean, how's a guy going to keep from hitting you when—" "Catch him!" Mark Williams cried, but the trooper was too late. The other man plunged forward to the ground and lay where he had fallen without quivering. The clock in the hall struck 2 with muted strokes. Cautiously, Edith Williams rose on her elbow and looked down at her husband's face. His eyes opened and looked back at her. "You're awake," she said unnecessarily. "I woke up a few minutes ago," he answered. "I've been lying here thinking." "I'll get you another phenobarbital. Dr. Amos said for you to take them and sleep until tomorrow." "I know. I'll take one presently. You know, hearing that clock just now reminded me of something." "Yes?" "Just before I came to this afternoon, after the crash, I had a strange impression of hearing a bell ring. It sounded so loud in my ears I opened my eyes to see where it was." "A bell?" "Yes. Just auditory hallucination, of course." "But Mark—" "Yes?" A bell did ring. I mean, I had the crystal bell in my bag, and it tinkled a little. Do you suppose—" "Of course not." But though he spoke swiftly, he did not sound convincing. This was a loud bell, like a great gong. "But, I mean, Mark, darling, a moment earlier you had no pulse." "No pulse?" "And you weren't breathing. Then the crystal bell tinkled, and you—" Nonsense. I know what you're thinking, and believe me, it's nonsense. But Mark, she spoke carefully, the driver of the other car, he had no sooner regained consciousness than he had a fractured skull, Dr. Williams interrupted sharply. The ambulance intern diagnosed it. Skull fractures often fail to show themselves, and then bingo, you keel over. That's what happened. Now let's say no more about it. Of course, in the hall, the clock struck the quarter hour. Shall I fix the phenobarbital now? Yes. No. Is David home? She hesitated. No, he hasn't got back yet. Has he phoned? He knows he's supposed to be in by midnight at the latest. No, he hasn't phoned, but there's a school dance tonight. That's no excuse for not phoning. He has the old car, hasn't he? Yes, you gave him the keys this morning, remember? All the more reason he should phone. Dr. Williams lay silent a moment. 2 o'clock is too late for a 17-year-old boy to be out. I'll speak to him. He won't do it again. Now, please, Mark, let me give you the phenobarbital. I'll stay up until David. The ringing phone, a clamor in the darkness interrupted her. Mark Williams reached for it. The extension was beside the bed. Hello, he said, and then, although she could not hear the answering voice, she felt him stiffen, and she knew. As well as if she could hear the words, she knew, with a mother's instinct for disaster. Yes, Dr. Williams said. Yes, I see. I understand. I'll come at once. Thank you for calling. He slid out of bed before she could stop him. An emergency call, he spoke quietly. I have to go. He began to throw on his clothes. It's David, she said, isn't it? She sat up. Don't try to keep me from knowing. It's about David. Yes, he said. His voice was very tired. David is hurt. I have to go to him. An accident. He's dead, she said it steadily. David's dead, isn't he, Mark? He came over and sat beside her and put his arms around her. Edith, he said. Edith. Yes, he's dead, 40 minutes ago. The car went over a curve. They have him at the county morgue. They want me to identify him. Identify him. Edith, you see, the car caught fire. I'm coming with you, she said. I'm coming with you. The taxi waited in a pool of darkness between 2 streetlights. The long, low building, which was the county morgue, a blue lamp over its door, stood below the street level. A flight of concrete steps went down to it from the sidewalk. 10 minutes before, Dr. Mark Williams had gone down these steps. Now he climbed back up them, stiffly, wearily, like an old man. Edith was waiting in the taxi, sitting forward on the edge of the seat, hands clenched. As he reached the last step, she opened the door and stepped out. Mark? She asked shakily. Was it? Yes, it's David. His voice was a monotone. Our son. I've completed the formalities. For now, the only thing we can do is go home. I'm going to him. She tried to pass. He caught her wrist. Discreetly, the taxi driver pretended to doze. No, Edith, there's no need. You mustn't see him. He's my son, she cried. Let me go. No. What have you got under your coat? It's the bell, the rose crystal bell, she cried. I'm going to ring it where David can hear. Defiantly, she brought forth her hand, clutching the little bell. It brought you back, Mark. Now it's going to bring back David. Edith, he said in horror, you mustn't believe that's possible. You can't. Those are coincidences. Now let me have it. No, I'm going to ring it. Violently, she tried to break out of his grip. I want David back. I'm going to ring the bell. She got her hand free. The crystal bell rang in the quiet of the early morning with an eerie thinness, penetrating the silence like a silver knife. There, Edith Williams panted. I've rung it. I know you don't believe, but I do. It'll bring David back. She raised her voice. David, she called. David, son, can you hear me? Edith, Dr. Williams groaned. You're just tormenting yourself. Come home. Please come home. Not until David has come back. David, David, can you hear me? She rang the bell again, rang it until Dr. Williams seized it. Then she let him take it. Edith, Edith, he groaned, if only you had let me come alone. Mark, listen. What? Listen, she whispered with fierce urgency. He was silent, and then fingers of horror drew themselves down his spine at the clear youthful voice that came up to them from the darkness below. Mother? Dad? Where are you? David, Edith Williams breathed. It's David. Let me go. I must go to him. No, Edith, her husband whispered frantically as the voice below called again. Dad, Mother, are you up there? Wait for me. Let me go, she sobbed. David, we're here. We're up here, son. Edith, Mark Williams gasped. If you've ever loved me, listen to me. You mustn't go down there. David, I had to identify him by his class ring and his wallet. He was burned, terribly burned. I'm going to him. She wrenched herself free and sped for the steps, up which now was coming a tall form, a shadow shrouded in the darkness. Dr. Williams, horror knotting his stomach, leaped to stop her, but he slipped and fell headlong on the pavement so that she was able to pant down the stairs to meet the upcoming figure. Oh, David, she sobbed, David! Hey, Mom, the boy held her steady. I'm sorry, I'm terribly sorry, but I didn't know what had happened till I got home, and you weren't there, and then one of the fellows from the fraternity called me. I realized they must have made a mistake, and you'd come here, and I called for a taxi and came out here. My taxi let me off at the entrance around the block. But I've been looking for you down there. Poor Pete. Pete, she asked. Pete Friedberg. He was driving the old car. I lent him the keys and my driver's license. I shouldn't have. But he's older and he kept begging me. Then it's Pete who was killed, she gasped. Pete who was burned. Yes, Pete. I feel terrible about lending him the car. But he was supposed to be a good driver. Then them calling you and Dad thinking it was me. Then Mark was right. Of course he was right. She was laughing and sobbing now. It's just a bell. A pretty little bell, that's all. Bell? I don't follow you, Mom. Never mind, Edith Williams gasped. It's just a bell. It hasn't any powers over life and death. It doesn't bring back and it doesn't take away. But let's get back up to your father. He may be thinking that the bell really worked. They climbed the rest of the steps. Dr. Mark Williams still lay where he had fallen headlong on the pavement. The cab driver was bending over him, but there was nothing to be done. The crystal bell had been beneath him when he fell, and it had broken. One long, fine splinter of crystal was embedded in his heart. End of Ring Once for Death. Recording by Chris Pyle.
Number 1, A Branch Line, The Signalman, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Addison. Number 1, Branch Line, The Signalman, by Charles Dickens. Hallo! Below there! When he heard a voice thus calling to him, he was standing at the door of his box with a flag in his hand, furled round its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came, but instead of looking up to where I stood, on the top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what. But I know it was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down in the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. "Halloa! Below!" From looking down the line, he turned himself about again, and raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. "Is there any path by which I can come down and speak to you?" He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him, without pressing him too soon with a repetition of my idle question. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back, as though it had force to draw me down. When such vapour as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed me and was skimming away over the landscape, I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. I repeated my inquiry. After a pause, during which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level, some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called down to him, "All right," and made for that point. There, by dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough, zigzag, descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitate. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. For these reasons I found the way long enough to give me time to recall a singular air of reluctance or compulsion with which he had pointed out the path. When I came down low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw that he was standing between the rails on the way by which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as if he were waiting for me to appear. He had his left hand at his chin, and that left elbow rested on his right hand, crossed over his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my downward way, and stepping out upon the level of the railroad and drawing nearer to him, saw that he was a dark sallow man with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. On either side a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way, only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. The shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him. Not even then removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. This was a lonesome post to occupy, I said, and it had riveted my attention when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor was a rarity, I should suppose, not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. In me he merely saw a man who had been shut up within narrow limits all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, but I am far from sure of the terms I used. For besides that I am not happy in opening any conversation, there was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and looked all about it, as if something were missing from it, and then looked at me. That light was part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice, "Don't you know it is?" The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face, that this was a spirit, not a man. I have speculated since whether there may have been infection in his mind. In my turn I stepped back, but in making the action I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous thought to flight. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." "I was doubtful," he returned, "whether I had seen you before." "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "There," I said. Intently watchful of me, he replied, but without sound, "Yes." "My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I never was there, you may swear." "I think I may," he rejoined. "Yes, I am sure I may." His manner cleared like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness, and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Yes, that was to say, he had enough responsibility to bear, but exactness and watchfulness were what was required of him, and of actual work, manual labour, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then, was all he had to do under that head. Regarding those many long and lonely hours of which I seemed to make so much, he could only say that the routine of his life had shaped itself into that form, and he had grown used to it. He had taught himself a language down here, if only to know it by sight, and to have formed his own crude ideas of its pronunciation could be called learning it. He had also worked at fractions and decimals, and tried a little algebra. But he was, and had been as a boy, a poor hand at figures. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, always to remain in that channel of damp air, and could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon times and circumstances. Under some conditions there would be less upon the line than under others, and the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather he did choose occasions for getting a little above these lower shadows, but being at all times liable to be called by his electric bell, and at such times listening for it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than I would suppose. He took me into his box, where there was a fire, a desk for an official book in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial face and needles, and the little bell of which he had spoken. On my trusting that he would excuse the remark that he had been well educated, and I hoped I might say without offence, perhaps educated above that station, he observed that instances of slight incongruity in such wise would rarely be found wanting among large bodies of men, that he had heard it was so in workhouses, in the police force, even in that last desperate resource, the army, and that he knew it was so, more or less, in any great railway style. He had been, when young, if I could believe it, sitting in that hut, he scarcely could, a student of natural philosophy, and had attended lectures, but he had run wild, misused his opportunities, gone down, and never risen again. He had no complaint to offer about that. He had made his bed, and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. All that I have here condensed, he said in a quiet manner, with his grave dark regards divided between me and the fire. He threw in the word "sir" from time to time, and especially when he referred to his youth, as though to request me to understand that he claimed to be nothing but what I found him. He was several times interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed, and make some verbal communication to the driver. In the discharge of his duties I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse at a syllable, and remaining silent until what he had to do was done. In a word, I should have set this man down as one of the safest of men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a falling colour, turned his face towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of those occasions he came back to the fire with the inexplicable air upon him which I had remarked, without being able to define, when we were so far asunder. Said I, when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I have met with a contented man." I am afraid I must acknowledge that I said it to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so," he rejoined, in the low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir, I am troubled." He would have recalled the words if he could. He had said them, however, and I took them up quickly. "With what? What is your trouble?" "It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very, very difficult to speak of. If ever you make me another visit, I will try to tell you." "But I expressly intend to make you another visit. Say, when shall it be?" "I go off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 to-morrow night, sir." "I will come at 11." He thanked me and went out at the door with me. "I'll show my white light, sir," he said, in his peculiar low voice, "till you have found the way up. When you have found it, don't call out. And when you are at the top, don't call out." His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than "Very well." "And when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry 'Halloa, below there' tonight?" "Heaven knows," said I. "I cried something to that effect." "Not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well." "Admit those were the very words. I said them, no doubt, because I saw you below." "For no other reason." "What other reason could I possibly have?" "You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He wished me good night, and held up his light. I walked by the side of the down line of rails, with a very disagreeable sensation of a train coming behind me, until I found the path. It was easier to mount than to descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag next night, as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me at the bottom with his white light on. "I have not called out," I said, when we came close together. "May I speak now?" "By all means, sir." "Good night, then, and here's my hand." "Good night, sir, and here's mine." With that we walked side by side to his box, entered it, closed the door, and sat down by the fire. "I have made up my mind, sir," he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated, and speaking in a tone but a little above a whisper, "that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for some one else yesterday evening. That troubles me." "That mistake?" "No, that some one else." "Who is it?" "I don't know." "Like me?" "I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved, violently waved, this way." I followed his action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence. "For God's sake, clear the way!" "One moonlight night," said the man, "I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, 'Halloa, below there!' I started up, looked from that door, and saw this some one else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving, as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it cried, 'Look out! Look out!' and then again, 'Halloa, below there! Look out!' I caught up my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, 'What's wrong? What has happened? Where?' It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping the sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up at it, and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away when it was gone. "Into the tunnel?" said I. "No. I ran on into the tunnel 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head, and saw the figure of the measured distance, and saw the wet stain stealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again, faster than I had run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me, and I looked all round the red light with my own red light, and I went up the iron ladder to the gallery atop of it, and I came down again and ran back here. I telegraphed both ways. 'An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong?' The answer came back both ways. 'All well.' Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out my spine, I showed him how that this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and how that figures originating in disease of the delicate nerves that minister to the functions of the eye were known to have often troubled patients, some of whom had become conscious of the nature of their affliction, and had even proved it by experiments upon themselves. 'As to an imaginary cry,' said I, 'do but listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley while we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires.' That was all very well," he resumed, after we had sat listening for a while, "and he ought to know something of the wind and the wires, he who so often passed long winter nights there, alone and watching. But he would beg to remark that he had not finished." I asked his pardon, and he slowly added these words touching my arm: "Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened, and within 10 hours the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood." A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. "It was not to be denied," I rejoined, "that this was a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress his mind. But it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and they must be taken into account in dealing with such a subject. Though, to be sure, I must admit," I added, for I thought I saw that he was going to bring the objection to bear upon me, "men of common sense did not allow much for coincidences in making the ordinary calculations of life." He again begged to remark that he had not finished. I again begged his pardon for being betrayed into interruptions. "This," he said again, laying his hand upon my arm and glancing over his shoulder with hollow eyes, "was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and shock when, one morning, as the day was breaking, I, standing at that door, looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again." He stopped with a fixed look at me. "Did it cry out?" "No, it was silent." "Did it wave its arm?" "No. It leaned against the shaft of the light with both hands before the face." like this. Once more I followed his action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I have seen such an attitude in stone figures on tombs. Did you go up to it? I came in and sat down, partly to collect my thoughts, partly because it had turned me faint. When I went to the door again, daylight was above me, and the ghost was gone. But nothing followed. Nothing came of this. He touched me on the arm with his forefinger twice or thrice, giving a ghastly nod each time. That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed at a carriage window on my side what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver, "Stop!" He shut off and put his brake on, but the train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along, heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments, and was brought in here, and laid down on this floor between us. Involuntarily I pushed my chair back, as I looked from the boards at which he pointed to himself. True, sir, true. Precisely as it happened, so I tell it to you. I could think of nothing to say to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. The wind and the wires took up the story with a long lamenting wail. He resumed, "Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since it has been there, now and again by fits and starts. At the light, at the danger light. What does it seem to do?" He repeated, if possible with increased passion and vehemence, that former gesticulation of "For God's sake, clear the way!" Then he went on, "I have no peace or rest for it. It calls to me for many minutes together in an agonized manner. 'Below there! Look out! Look out!' It stands waving to me. It rings my little bell." I caught at that. "Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here and you went to the door?" "Twice." "Why, see," said I, "how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell, and my ears were open to the bell, and if I am a living man, it did not ring at those times. No, nor at any other time, except when it was rung in the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you." He shook his head. "I have never made a mistake as to that yet, sir. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration in the bell that it derives from nothing else, and I have not asserted that the bell stirs to the eye. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, but I heard it." "And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out?" "It was there. Both times," he repeated firmly. "Both times. Will you come to the door with me and look for it now?" He bit his underlip as though he were somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the step, while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the high wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars above them. "Do you see it?" I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not very much more so, perhaps, than my own had been when I had directed them earnestly towards the same spot. "No," he answered, "it is not there." "Agreed," said I. We went in again, shut the door, and resumed our seats. I was thinking how best to improve this advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the conversation in such a matter-of-course way, so assuming that there could be no serious question of fact between us, that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions. "By this time you will fully understand, sir," he said, "that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean?" I was not sure, I told him, that I did fully understand. "What is its warning against?" he said, ruminating, with his eyes on the fire, and only by times turning them on me. "What is the danger? Where is the danger? There is danger overhanging somewhere on the line. Some dreadful calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this third time, after what has gone before. But surely this is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do?" He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the drops from his heated forehead. "If I telegraph danger on either side of me, or on both, I can give no reason for it," he went on, wiping the palms of his hands. "I should get into trouble and do no good. They would think I was mad. This is the way it would work. Message, danger, take care. Answer, what danger, where? Message, don't know. But for God's sake take care. They would displace me. What else could they do?" His pain of mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. "When it first stood under the danger light," he went on, putting his dark hair back from his head, and drawing his hands outward across and across his temples in an extremity of feverish distress, "why not tell me where the accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could have been averted? When on its second coming it hid its face, why not tell me instead, 'She is going to die. Let them keep her at home'? If it came, on those two occasions, only to show me that its warnings were true, and so to prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? And I, Lord help me, a mere poor signalman on this solitary station, why not go to somebody with credit to be believed and power to act?" When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded far better than in the attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 in the morning. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear of it. that I more than once looked back at the red light as I ascended the pathway, that I did not like the red light, and that I should have slept but poorly if my bed had been under it, I see no reason to conceal. Nor did I like the two sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran most in my thoughts was the consideration how ought I to act, having become the recipient of this disclosure. I had proved the man to be intelligent, vigilant, painstaking, and exact. But how long might he remain so, in his state of mind? Though in a subordinate position, still he held the most important trust, and would I, for instance, like to stake my own life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with precision? Unable to overcome a feeling that there would be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors in the company, without first being plain with himself and proposing a middle course to him, I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him, otherwise keeping his secret for the present, to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in those parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come round next night, he had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or two after sunrise, and on again soon after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back, and it would then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, for in a moment I saw that this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance, to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft a little low hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing self-reproachful fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there, and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What is the matter?" I asked the man. "Signalman killed this morning, sir." "Not the man belonging to that box?" "Yes, sir. Not the man I know." "You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him," said the man, who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarpaulin, "for his face is quite composed." "Oh, how did this happen? How did this happen?" I asked, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again. "He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel his back was towards her, and she cut him down. That man drove her, and was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." The man, who wore a rough dark dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. "Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir," he said. "I saw him at the end, like as if I saw him down a perspective glass. There was no time to check speed, and I knew him to be very careful. As he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle, I shut it off when we were running down upon him, and called to him as loud as I could call." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Below there! Look out! Look out! For God's sake! Clear the way!'" I started. "Oh, it was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes not to see, and I waved this arm to the last, but it was no use." Without prolonging the narrative, to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than any other, I may, in closing it, point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine-driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached, and that only in my own mind, to the gesticulation he had imitated. End of Number 1, Branch Line, The Signalman,